how do we make decisions about what stays and what goes. And so often we have initiatives that come in and they're not really evaluated. They kind of stick around, they hang around, and sometimes, you know, half the people don't remember that they're even doing them, and another half of people spending all their time continuing to do them. But actually we need to be really explicit about how we're asking teachers to spend their time and subject leaders to spend their time. And that is kind of twofold. So firstly, it's these questions around what is going to have the most impact on our students in terms of how we use our time, and really importantly, what is going to reduce our teachers' workload. Because if we are asking to bring in any kind of policy, it needs to pass those two tests, and it doesn't really matter if it only passes one. That's really not enough. We can have the most incredible marking policy in the world, but it's not going to be any good if it's taking teachers hours and hours and hours to do. That's not efficient, it's not effective. And so as senior leaders, if we want to create the conditions for good curriculum work, we need to strip back anything that stops us from doing that. And I think once we've looked at the policies and practices that we have in place, we then need to be thinking about, well, who can do this work? I mean, ultimately, it's our subject specialists, it's our subject leaders, it's our teachers that can do this really important curriculum work. So if we're asking those same people to spend lots of time on data or lots of time on really cumbersome workload heavy marking policies, then that's not going to help that work to happen. And in a school, you might have many people that can analyse data, or you can bring in someone that does the reprographics, so that you've not got someone, you know, stood by a photocopier for 20 minutes every day, when actually the work they should be doing is around that curriculum development. So if we want to create the conditions, I think we need to think really hard about what we're asking people to do and why we're asking them to do it. And I think that kind of that's the starting point for the whole book, and really it's a starting point for any curriculum work we do, because if we want it to be successful, we can't just reach out for quick fixes. We can't say, well, if you fill in this form, if you write this intent statement, or if you you make a document, and that's curriculum done. That's not the case at all. It actually takes a really long time to do good curriculum work. It's also never finished, and it takes a huge amount of thought and consideration and research and training and coaching for you to do that curriculum work. And so if you don't make time for that, it's never going to be particularly successful. And I think that was kind of the premise of the book, is if you're going to carry on reading this, if you're going to carry on thinking about how we do curriculum work, you need to start by creating those conditions, by making sure that teachers and subject leaders have the tools to do that work, but also they have the time to do that work. And I do think that, you know, subject leaders do have a lot of power over that. Kat, I don't know if you've got...
Yeah, I think it's as you say, if we start using subject leaders and subject specialists as administration operatives, you're not just disempowering them, distracting them from curriculum work, you're also really not spending maybe staff resourcing that effectively. It's a very expensive use of teacher time for an admin task, and so it is about making sure that the right people are in the right places. I think also when you think about use of time in schools, particularly for curriculum, it's okay if we're how are we communicating that as a priority through our use of time. So having a look at your whole school calendar as a senior leadership team, having those conversations around the table when you're putting the calendar together, and thinking about, okay, well, what's everybody's agenda, where are our pinch points, are we setting our subject leaders to work on the curriculum at the same time that we've included our data drops, or at the same time that we've included parents' evening, or, you know, are we delivering curriculum CPD at the same time that we've got open evening the following night? Because one of those things is going to get everybody's attention. And so time is a brilliant way of not only giving people the time to do the work, but also communicating the priority, I think, is absolutely fundamental there. I think there's a great deal to be said as well for that communication of time and communication to making sure that the staff body understand how important it is. But not only that, is we're handing over a great deal of trust to our subject leaders, and rightly so, because they're our subject specialists. And so actually making time to do that work, to carry out development of the curriculum, is really quite empowering for subject leaders and teachers. If we're thinking about current conversations around retention and and movement of teachers around the profession around schools, that's probably your best bet for hanging on to staff, is making them feel empowered and giving them ownership and autonomy over their subjects. That's the reason that we all came into teaching in the first place, is to feel fired up to to come in and talk about teaching, or think about teaching, or have academic conversations with other subject specialists about teaching. And so I think as senior leaders, we have a moral responsibility and a duty of care to make sure that there is time for that in schools, definitely.
Sorry, I'm tweeting everything. I can't.
Right. You take your time, Jake.
No, I know, it's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've talked then about getting time for subjects to making it a priority, etc. But what do our subjects actually need to consider then? When they do meet, when they do discuss curriculum, what sort of conversations do they need to have, and what considerations do they need to make?
I think we need to start with, what do we want our children to know from our subject? What do we want them to be able to do in our subject? And actually those are both quite simple questions and fairly huge, but I think what underpins that is we want to take our children beyond their experiences of school and take them beyond this recontextualization of often lots of our disciplines, where what they look like in school is quite different to what they look like in the field. And so I think that we need to start by considering, what do we want our children to know about our actual subjects, but not in their sometimes quite manipulated way that they come into the classroom. So for example, if you take English, some of the ways that English is taught is so far removed from proper literary criticism and proper literary study. Actually, how do we bring children into this kind of scholarly pursuit of our subjects, and where that real beauty lies, rather than thinking about what the exam is going to be, or how to use acronyms, or how to use simplified versions of bringing them into our subject. Actually, most of the time, if we want our children to be successful, it's about bringing them to the beauty of our subjects and what made us want to teach them in the first place. And I think sometimes there's quite a disconnect between what we're actually teaching and what we love about our subject, which I think is really interesting. I think with the moves that we've made in terms of what curriculum looks like now, we have an opportunity to really teach our subjects and come back to that core of what our discipline should look like, and make sure that our lessons do pay service to that, and our curriculum pays service to what our that scholarly pursuit of our subjects. I also think, and this is something that comes up quite a lot, is when people contact Kat and I to ask about their curriculum development, often it's from a perspective of, well, we've got a curriculum in place, what do we do with it? And unless you go into a school that is brand new, you're going to have a curriculum that's already there. And so for what subject leaders need to consider is actually, where's the diagnosis first? We need to diagnose what's already in place. We need to be thinking about what's least useful, what's most useful, what's the least connected, what makes sense at different points in our curriculum and what doesn't, and start there. Because what we don't really want is for us to say, well, we're going to do curriculum work, that means we're going to throw everything out and start again, because that's often not really necessary. But what we can do is we can think about, well, in terms of what we have in place now, how can we make those connections more meaningful? How can we see where key concepts appear and reappear, rather than kind of saying, well, we're going to start again. I've seen this scheme of work on Twitter or on the internet. Well, let's use that because that looks really good. Actually, we need to think about what we've got in front of us already, because all of our curriculum will come to us with some history, with some ancestry, who's put these units in place. And if we're saying, usually we get these questions come to us from perhaps new subject leaders who are coming into a new department saying, the curriculum's not quite right here and I've been asked to make changes. Well, actually, if we want to bring people with us, we need to be having conversations around, why is this here? Why is this important? And in order to get buy-in from everyone around what curriculum changes we might want to make, we need to be really clear about why we might make those changes. And explaining how we can make those connections more meaningful and why that's important. And I think sometimes that's get lost, because I think what sometimes happens is that people get really enthusiastic and really carried away, and they see something and say, right, okay, we're going to do this because this looks great. But actually, if you don't have that conversation, if you don't have that ongoing development as a team, what you end up with is, sometimes resentment from staff, sometimes a feeling of, being very disconnected from what they're teaching. And actually, so often when you just look at a curriculum map, it's quite difficult to see what lies underneath it, of course. And so it's really important to do that work first, to do that diagnostic work first, before you kind of say, well, we're going to put this in and we're going to put that in, because there might be really good reasons why different things are in place. So I think you're looking at diagnosis of your curriculum.
It's almost front loading the thinking as such, isn't it? That so in so many cases, and we've all been guilty of this, of getting really overexcited because we're so passionate about our subject specialisms, of seeing something and thinking, I'd love to teach that with our children, when perhaps it isn't the right time for the team that you're working with. It isn't the right time for where the remainder of your curriculum is. And actually, we can't paint by numbers when it comes to curriculum mapping, and it's giving time to that. The conversations, particularly, as Claire says, a new subject leader, of getting to know your team, getting to know what your team's strengths are, because it's not an isolated job working curriculum, and it shouldn't be. Ultimately, those members of your team are the curriculum designers of the future, and should be feeling informed and empowered to have those conversations along the way, so that they're when they reach that role, they've already got the knowledge there. They're not playing catch up, because they're part of those conversations along the way. And I think kind of building on the successes of what's already there and what's come before, that you'll never need to come to a curriculum and rip it up entirely and start again. But actually, it's really quite powerful that we can have those conversations and do that as a collaborative pursuit, as a piece of work that everybody feels involved in, and everybody's being educated in along the way. They're really quite intellectual academic conversations that we need to have about a curriculum. I think sometimes, particularly at subject level, we're trying to solve really complex problems with simple solutions. So we're looking for, so with an English hat on again, is okay, we need to cover poetry, we need to do a Shakespeare, and we need to do some language, and we need to make sure that we hit all the AOs before we get to Key Stage 4, so that they're not, they're not underprepared, when actually it's not that simple, and it's not that straightforward, and where we're not being loyal to our subject if we try to dilute it down to, let's spend 6 weeks looking at some GCSE poetry because it means it will be more difficult. Then we'll look at 6 weeks of something else entirely. Instead, actually, and in the book we talk about concept mapping and spending that time mapping out how your curriculum joins up. Where are the threads that flow all the way from, if you're lucky enough to work in all through like I do, from if we're looking at EYFS through to Key Stage 1, through to Key Stage 2, where are those students continually bumping into and building upon in a very sustainable, cumulative fashion the nature of the subject, and so it's far more scholarly, but also as a teacher far more rewarding to have those conversations with the knowledge that that informed education, that where those children have come from. It's far more enriching for you as well as the students, I think. And I think it's really important to not sometimes hurtle into things that we get excited about, when actually there's so much work in that front loading of thinking, I think.
And I think that what you picked up here is this idea of those connections that are being made, and actually making sure that those connections aren't just ostensible, they aren't just on the surface, they're actually deep and meaningful, and they help our students to understand the subject better. I think it can be a case that we might say, okay, well we do we do Victorians in year 7, so when we get to year 9 and we talk about something Victorian again, we're going to have those connections in place. But actually that's on such a surface level, and actually what we need to be thinking about isn't so much the content very often, it's the concepts, it's the language, it's the ideas that underpin that content. That's what we need to be considering when we're thinking about this cohesive and coherent curriculum, that actually it's not about repeating content, it's about where concepts and ideas repeat or rhyme, where we can see patterns that are occurring throughout our curriculum, and where do those patterns allow our students to better understand the subjects? Where do they allow us to elaborate on things they've already been taught in order for them to have a much more secure understanding of what they're going to be taught next? And I think that sometimes what can happen is when you're looking at on a content level what you're mapping, and you're saying, we repeat this content here and here and here and here, actually you can lose sight of why you might want to repeat that and why you might want to show those patterns. And so that's something that I think is really important to consider. And it's part of, when you're thinking about your curriculum, you're thinking about the unifying principles of your curriculum. So in quite hierarchical subjects like science and maths, where there is a far tighter framework that you follow, because there are threshold concepts that if you do not teach those concepts, then students can't move past to the next thing. That gives you a really clear unifying principle, that hierarchy. But when you're looking at subjects that aren't so hierarchical, that are more cumulative, like history, like English, like other humanities subjects like RE, then actually what you're looking for is, where are those unifying principles? Maybe it's chronology, maybe it's conceptual. Where are those that allow us to see a very clear thread that is weaving its way through our curriculum to help students see that this isn't just this kind of very episodic, fragmented scheme of learning. This is actually building a bigger picture around making connections so that students have a much better idea of what our subject really means and really is. And similarly, in terms of things like cognitive load, if we are really explicit and really careful about the connections that we're making at each stage of the curriculum, that means that we're constantly drawing on prior knowledge in a really meaningful way. And by doing so, when we then try to teach something that's new, we have all of that background that's supporting our students in accessing this new learning, because they're not everything is brand new and being taught to them at that one point. Actually, there's lots and lots of foundation work that's happening that leads to that. And I think that's where curriculum can be incredibly powerful, not just in terms of that overall mapping, that overall conceptual mapping, but it can be really powerful in terms of the delivery of that curriculum work, those concepts, because students recognise them. Nothing's new, nothing's a shock.
Yeah, I think you've got as well, when you're saying about kind of, so it's less superficial and less surface based, you've also got this added to the fact that maybe sometimes we don't work collaboratively enough across faculties, so across subjects, to almost mutually benefit. That the idea of symbiosis, mutually benefit from one another's teaching. So and in quite a meaningful way, not surface. History are doing colonialism, so we'll hopefully cover that off in the Tempest. But actually, have we looked at the content that history are delivering? Have we looked at the common language that we might be able to share, so that students are familiar with that when it comes to our own delivery and discussing colonialism in English, so that we are actually teasing through that prior knowledge in quite a meaningful way, rather than you've done this in history, where have we actually had those conversations with history to make sure that we're taking advantage of that time that's been spent in the classroom. I think sometimes we maybe don't notice how we could benefit from that almost, that's extra time as such. And I also think that sometimes we mistake better curriculum as more work for children, that sometimes that's translated as more work, let's just do more of it, when actually if we're talking about cognitive load, where does our curriculum enable students time for the thinking? Are we concentrating on producing stuff for books, or are we actually having those really meaningful, meaty conversations with students in the classroom that enable them to draw through that prior knowledge that maybe isn't actualized in a book, or isn't evidenced or proofed, that it's more it's about the immeasurable, isn't it? It's about those conversations. And we all know as teachers that that's where students learn the most, is those rich conversations in the classroom where we're drawing through, we're teasing through what's come before and using it in the current, and you can't always put that on a piece of paper, but that's the meaty work, isn't it?
And I think also that kind of comes back to thinking about the real heritage of your subject. So where has your subject come from? You know, where are those contentions, those debates? Where do we not have definitive answers? And also, you know, where did we not have answers before and where do we have them now? This is where you can bring in that really meaningful disciplinary knowledge, where you're thinking about and you're talking to students about, well, these are the contentions in this subject. This is where people disagree. This is where the debating is. And actually that brings students into that dialogue around our subjects, that allows them to see that it's a living thing. You know, there are, in nearly all subjects, there is work that's happening now that will influence or has influenced, you know, the subject itself, and that it's not this dry thing that's in the classroom. Actually, there is a world out there where these arguments are happening, these debates are happening. And I think that in itself, you know, we've got the Gatsby benchmarks where they talk about linking things to careers. Actually, that's where that opportunity lies. It isn't in, you know, kind of surface level connecting with a journalist. Actually, talking about the contentions of the subject brings us into, well, who is it that's doing this work outside of education? How is this work meaningful outside of education? So that thinking time, that debating time, and that knowledge of the teacher around, you know, what does their subject look like in the field, can bring such richness and life to our curriculum that makes it, you know, far more purposeful for students. You know, when they say, why are we studying this? Well, actually, if you're talking about, well, people are still arguing about this.
The exam. And how many times have you heard that? It's for the exam. And you're like, how, you know, that would make you question as an adult why you're doing something. So why sometimes is it you know, an acceptable response for and a rationale for children, and it isn't. But I think that when we're thinking about if we kind of come back to the original question of the subject leader's responsibility, ultimately you want to put your subject leaders and give them the capacity to be able to articulate the curriculum for themselves. Can they walk through, and again, this is measuring the immeasurable, it's those conversations instead of checklists, you know, instead of have you got your retrieval practice in here, have you mapped out your curriculum against history or art? It's actually having those conversations around, talk me through your curriculum. Explain to me how you made the choices that you made, and enabling subject leaders to take the time to think about what their answers are to that, and the thought that's come before that conversation, I think is vital.
But I do think that, you know, when you are thinking about that mapping out of your curriculum, really being clear about not exactly that not that checklist of, well, have you got this, have you got this, have you got this, actually having proper conversations around, well, what is the knowledge you want children to know, how do you want them to apply it? And I think sometimes we can have curriculums that are just kind of skill mapping. We're going to map out the skills, and you know, year 7 they're going to evaluate, and that year 8 they're going to synthesize or whatever it might be. But actually, if we don't talk about the knowledge they're learning, we're missing the point, because ultimately skills, if you want to call them that, you know, are a manifestation of knowledge in practice. That's what happens. Yeah. You can't do something without substance. And so actually, when we're thinking about our curriculum, I think it's been really explicit about what we want to be teaching, and not kind of going down the route of, you know, checklists of have we got a knowledge organiser, have we got this, have we got that, and certainly not, or by the end of year 9 they'll be able to evaluate, analyse and comprehend, or whatever that might be.
They won't. Yeah. And I think it's training people to be able to have those conversations better, because I think historically, particularly when you've got people working in isolation on different areas of the curriculum, it becomes about people's work, and it becomes a difficult conversation because people feel protective of areas that they've worked in isolation. If you're working something on your own, then it's far more difficult, one, to have perspective over what you've produced. That needs a sounding board, which is why collaborative planning is so important, but also that we're having conversations about the thing. We're having conversations conversations about the work, this issue of the curriculum is this collaborative, collective, continual problem that we're all going to talk about, rather than, oh, well, your unit didn't quite fit with this other unit that worked a little bit better. That we're moving away from those conversations and actually talking about the thing, talking about the work, rather than people, which it unifies people in such a more meaningful way.
And I think that kind of brings us to that CPD around curriculum as well. Is, so much of our CPD focuses on the how, the pedagogy, which sometimes can be really generic and does mean that you are mangling and manipulating other disciplines. But actually, if you start with the what of your subject and of your curriculum, then actually we need to be thinking far more about what we know about our subject rather than necessarily, pedagogical practice. So one of the things I always find really interesting when I go and see lessons is very often, if I'm saying to someone, well, we need to do some work on your questioning, or we need to do some work on your modelling, the issue isn't that they don't know how to ask questions, or the issue isn't that they don't know how to model, they don't know the theory behind modelling. Yeah, the issue is that they don't necessarily know enough about the thing they're teaching, the what of what they're teaching, in order to construct questions that are really purposeful. And so actually, by focusing our time on subject knowledge, we are doing service to pedagogy as well, and actually it gives, empowers teachers to perhaps better understand and better think about the pedagogy they're using, because they know what pedagogy pays most service to their subject. And this is where we need to be really careful with genericism of these things, because inquiry questions in history is a really scholarly great approach. If you then start saying to maths, well, you're going to have inquiry questions because history doing it works there, you've got a serious problem, because you're completely mangling that subject and you're taking it well beyond that discipline in a way that's going to make your curriculum worse and not better.
But I think as a profession we've overlooked subject knowledge as a priority, and there's this assumption. I always remember being at something about an event about 5 years ago and having a conversation of this, is that as an English teacher it was almost that you got a book put in front of you, and the strapline was just stay 2 weeks ahead of the kids in where you're reading. And there's just that assumption that if you've done a degree in history, all history, go and teach history. If you've done a degree in science, all science, off you go. And actually we have a duty of care to continually revisit and refresh and improve our subject knowledge, which is infinite, and that's the beauty of teaching. And so where are we handing over the time in order to ensure that our teachers continue to not only engage with the subject but enjoy it, feel a sense of academic scholarship over what they're teaching? And if we're going to design, it comes back to the what and the how, doesn't it? If we're going to design this fantastic curriculum and we're putting incredibly challenging, meaningful work on there, how are we bringing along our staff to then ensure that they don't feel intimidated or daunted about what they're teaching, that actually they feel incredibly excited about it, because we've provided with the subject specific tools to do so. And that's been given, again, priority of time, that's been given time on the calendar. We're giving those opportunities for people to have conversations around their subject. It's such an oversight, I think, sometimes, because it's as you say, people understand the pedagogy and there's so much out there for thinking about the underpinning principles of questioning and modelling, but if you don't know how that perhaps translates to your subjects, then it's wasted, and that's when you run the risk of seeing it lethally mutated in the classroom, because everybody's trying to shoehorn this thing in that has become a school priority when they maybe not seen it actualized for their subject and what that should or might look like within their subject as a whole. I think subject knowledge and using the other strengths of your department. If I think of any English department I've worked in, we've all got extremely different English degrees. Where are we building the confidence and the future leadership skills of those individuals by using the curriculum as a vehicle to do that? So by having, I can't think of an imaginary name, Brenda who's got a linguistics degree, who, you know, which I would kill for, to deliver A-level language teaching, CPD, for the rest of the department, which Brenda can then go and put on her appraisal and have that really meaningful conversation at the end of the year and go, that made me feel fantastic, I got some fantastic feedback. Other fictional person, Hilary, then went and used it in her year 13 lesson, and that made me feel amazing because Hilary came to find me afterwards. That's such a powerful way to bring on your team. I love the fact that Lou's turned her mic off because she's probably too busy laughing at Hilary and Brenda. But that's such
She's
a
having a
powerful
giggle
way.
now, isn't she? She's giggling away.
Brenda,
I'm writing down.
You've never worked with a Brenda and a Hilary.
We all need to empower Brenda and Hilary. That's what we need to do.
But that's a really powerful way of bringing on people and using the curriculum as a vehicle for professional development. Which again, I really strongly believe that it is our best bet, our biggest win for, you know, not just kind of workload reduction, making people feel a sense of autonomy, but for developing people in the art of conversation, developing people to utilise and share their subject knowledge.
And there's another side to that as well, which is that, yes, it's about using the expertise of your department, but actually when you have novice teachers, you have trainee teachers, actually, although they may not come with the same knowledge or expertise on that specific thing, actually having those people involved in those curriculum conversations is a really good way of identifying misconceptions. It's a really good way of tackling that curse of the expert issue, because you've got someone who perhaps is looking at your curriculum through a different lens to someone who is, you know, very experienced and very knowledgeable, who is actually saying, well, actually, can you take me through those steps in a slightly more granular way, because they haven't, you know, experienced that curriculum as much, or they don't have that same knowledge. Actually can be a really useful new pair of eyes to look at your curriculum with you and have those conversations. And I think very often what we can do is we have our subject lead who goes away and writes the curriculum, and they put together resources and they give them to their department. And, you know, that's really good intentions of workload and support. But actually, if we don't involve those people, we might not see where the gaps are. We might not see where we need to break things down, or where we need to, or where we can, as Kat said, add more richness, because there are other people that have perspectives that they can bring.
And also, the more opportunities you have to do that, the more you're developing people's experience of having those respectfully honest conversations, again, about the work. I think there's a great deal of work that we can do as a profession in implicitly training. I don't mean sitting down in a room and let's all have CPD on how to have a conversation and how not to be rude about somebody else's work, because that's contrived and that's not about growing culture. But actually, how do we breed a culture where people are having the opportunity to be able to say, well, actually, I don't think that works quite well because this is how I taught it the other day, or, you know, let's all sit around, I'm going to teach year 8 this week, how do you think you'll approach this part? Okay, let's microscript this particular area. I've written a model, do you think that would work? And let's have a conversation about it. They're really, you know, fantastic conversations for any teacher at any level of the career to be having, but not just because it moves on their knowledge of the subject, but also it gives them repeated exposure to really positive models of what a decent conversation about their subject looks like. And I think that only comes through being given the time to do so, and it not feeling like another thing. I think that's really important. That's all I've got. Hi, Lou.
Thank you. I mean, that was a good question, wasn't it? Just saying.
Great.
I've got a red.
What, without yourself, Jane?
Right. I feel like you've answered this, but how does all this translate into the classroom? And can you tell me why pea and petal are a load of rubbish?
Oh, have you been listening to Mary? Because Mary got quite angry about it at the book launch.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus Christ. I think the roofs of churches came down that night, if I'm honest. I think the problem is that it's been diluted. It's a diluted version of there's not a single English degree out there that will teach you PE or petal, unfortunately, I'm sure. But I think if you've got a developed understanding of the curriculum, you've got a developed understanding of your subject, you've got a developed understanding of what that needs to or can look like in the classroom. So if we take workbooks as an example, which we discuss in the book as one instrument of the curriculum that you might use to deliver your subject, there is no one size fits all for workbooks, but that essentially the design of a workbook hangs on the nuance of the subject itself. If I look at the workbooks at Dustin across subjects, how we put together an English workbook will look entirely different to geography. It's completely differently designed. And if anything, we kind of strip back within English because it's so mindful of cognitive load, and it comes back to that idea of, okay, where are we handing over time for the thinking? But I think with teachers, if you have an informed understanding of your subject, you're then in a much better position to anticipate misconceptions. If you're having those conversations before you even go into the classroom, you already know the possible pitfalls. You already know where those students could possibly, digress or things could go awry. That you've already thought of strategies as to how you can compensate for that. And it comes back to Claire's comment around, questioning or modelling, that these are best approach and these are brilliant ways to approach that. But if you need to have those conversations, it needs to almost be, have the caveat, the preparation beforehand, so that you can see those coming. If I'm going to teach I don't know, Macbeth as a Machiavellian, I need to understand what that means. I need to understand the underpinning principles behind what I'm teaching in order to be able to ask the right questions and teach that out in the classroom. So I think subject knowledge is king there, but also if, as a classroom teacher, if you've been part of that curriculum planning, you're going to be so much more informed for when you walk into the classroom, rather than, okay, I've written a scheme of learning, here you are, here's a workbook, you've got 5 minutes, you're in that room and you're teaching Macbeth. And I'm not only completely underprepared, but I'm also really disempowered from what I'm teaching. And it then moves, doesn't it, to becoming an operative in the classroom rather than an academic. That, or a graduate profession, we should be looking to have academic intellectual conversations, I think.
And Lemov talks about this in the Research Ed Curriculum book, and kind of articulates something that I've seen when you have these kind of bought-in curriculums where you have a curriculum that's written by one person then given to another, is you just have someone tapping through a PowerPoint and they haven't got a relationship with that knowledge. And Lemov uses the anecdote of the teacher who has annotated all over their workbook, and they have thought about all the questions they're going to ask, and they've written down, where the misconception might be, which is fantastic, which is exactly what you want to be doing with, with those lesson materials. But when asked whether or not they've read the book that they're teaching in the first place, the answer is no, because I've spent all my time looking at these materials. And so if we move too far away from the core of the subject itself, then we kind of lose meaning, we lose purpose, and we lose that relationship. And if our teachers don't have a relationship with that knowledge, then our students aren't going to. And I think this is where again it comes back to those surface features, that performative approach to curriculum and performative approach to what we're teaching. And it happens with things like with retrieval practice, and we were talking about this just before we started, I think. But we have this danger that students have a lot of fragile knowledge, and we don't realise it's fragile, because when we ask them a question and we do it as a retrieval, like as a quiz at the beginning of a lesson or whatever, whenever you want to do it, they can answer and they can parrot their response. But that knowledge is really fragile because it cannot be applied to a different context. And so you might have a student who can give you the equation for volume, but then when you ask them to calculate the amount of liquid in a container, they can't tell you, even though your retrieval that you've been doing every 3 weeks on your cycle tells you they know the equation. When they try and apply it, they can't. And I think this is where we need to be really careful with those surface details, because I might be able to say to a student, well, what is capitalism? And they can tell me what that is. But when I ask them to write an essay, they can't do so. And so when we're asking students to make those connections between when we're delivering the curriculum and asking them to make those connections, I think our teachers need to be really clear about the questions they're asking through that retrieval and through those connections. So For example, if I were to be teaching an inspector course and I said, tell me what Berling's speech is just before the inspector enters on the stage, at the beginning of a lesson that I then go and look at exits and entrances in Macbeth, what I have an explicit connection that draws you into the discipline, draws you into what it means to write a play, what it means to be a playwright, what it means to have entrances and exits that bring drama to the text. And so when we're delivering that curriculum, when we're speaking to teachers about retrieval and about that delivery, what we're asking them to do is say, okay, where can you make these connections? Where can you make these more meaningful? And how can you ensure that what you're doing in delivering this is bringing some richness, bringing elaboration? And I think, one of my favourite metaphors for curriculum is the idea that the curriculum is like a dress pattern. And you can have your curriculum map and you can say, well, this is our dress pattern, but it takes the teacher with their knowledge, with their understanding of their classes, with their ways they're going to elaborate, to bring in those rich fabrics, that embroidery, those patterns that bring that dress pattern, that pattern to life, that make it something beautiful and something worthwhile. Because if we just deliver that basic structure without that elaboration, without that engagement with what we're teaching, what we have is something quite baseless, quite it's not exciting. And actually we want to make our subjects exciting.
I think you've also got this kind of misconception as a profession, and this comes from various different contributing factors, that learning is neat and learning is done and we can work through learning like a tick box, and we all know that's not the case. We know that failure is inevitable. We know that those mistakes that students make are inevitable. And actually that's what we should be seeing within the classroom. We should see students encountering failure, because we know that if in an ideal world we're retrieving information 2 or 3 weeks down the line, students are then retrieving it and then we move on. Or if we think about the historical model where we have, here's a 6-week unit of learning, and we're going to do a test at the end, and then we're never going to look at that information again, and that was very nice, wasn't it? And you definitely won't remember it in a year's time. If we start moving away from that and that performative element of teaching that I think anybody that's been through teacher training all had to buy into, because that's what people wanted to see. I need to ask the question of the kid that I know will definitely be able to answer my question. Actually, now, if we think more deeply about our subject, my role as a classroom teacher is to find the child that doesn't know the answer to my question, because actually that helps me ascertain, what do I need to reteach? Where have I not quite got it right? And that's probably one of my most powerful tools in the classroom, rather than, okay, I need to write 3 or 4 questions at the start of my lesson. They were about this time last year when we were teaching some stuff. It doesn't necessarily connect to what we're doing, and hopefully you'll remember it. You might not. Actually, instead, by having those conversations with students and discussions and questioning, really carefully plotted out questions, which is where our rehearsal comes in, our preparation, then I can ascertain who doesn't know, and then I can work out, okay, how am I going to correct that? Because I can't move on. I can't take you on a journey through the curriculum if you don't know that component of knowledge, and it's moving away from this. I think we do things at speed in schools generally, and so we've kind of gone full circle of that front loading of thinking. It's actually knowing when to slow down in the classroom and try and ascertain where your gaps are is actually more important than, okay, let's find the kids that know stuff and let's all listen to them, and by some sort of osmosis all the other kids will know because they heard that one kid say it that one time. The curriculum, it's simple solutions to complex problems. It is complicated and it is messy, and that's what the classroom should feel like, I think, a lot of the time.
I think this is the thing. I think picking up on that idea that so often, we have this kind of performance of learning. We ask, students questions because we want to not necessarily probe their understanding, but to performatively say, okay, well, they know that then, so we can move on. So that's our sorted. And sometimes that comes from, that hoop jumping that we often used to do, in terms of, you'd have someone observing you, and so you'd always ask.
I'm an outstanding practitioner because Stuart at the back said he knew it that one time. Yeah.
And actually our questioning needs to be really probing and actually teasing through, and not just asking one question, but asking a follow-up and a follow-up and a follow-up, and asking, how do you know? Why do you think that? And sometimes it's shutting up. I remember, I guess this probably comes back to that people development as well. I remember when I was an NQT, being told to use more high order questions. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. It means nothing to me, absolutely nothing. And then someone said, well, go and see this teacher because she's really good at it. And I watched her, and all she really did was not say anything. So she would ask a question, and then she would just, and then the
and everyone would hear it, and they'd all learn it.
But the student would then carry on talking, but then she would follow that up with, okay, well, how do you know that? Why do you think that? And then that kind of breaking it down, because actually very often we can ask a question of a student and they'll give us the right answer, and then you say, well, how do you know? And the way they got to that answer is full of misconceptions. And if we don't have that constant dialogue and that teasing and probing, we have this performance of understanding that isn't necessarily a reflection of what they actually know and can do. And I think that training is really important, that when we're coaching other teachers into this, it's getting them to think about, yes, you've got your general questions, but how are you going to take those further? How are you going to go deeper with that? And actually, it's okay for children not to know the answer. That doesn't mean you're not a very good teacher.
Yeah, don't feel uncomfortable with that silence, because it just informs you so that you can retrace your steps and think about what we need to return to. It's okay to go back.
Cool. I think I'm gonna stick to this question. I have so many questions though later, honestly. But actually, no, just picking up on what you just said then, Claire, about your teacher training and stuff like that. So how could we use sort of curriculum development as a vehicle for our professional development as well?
So
yeah, I think we've talked about a few kind of concrete examples, probably useful because we've touched on this, haven't we? But I think collaborative planning and working collaboratively, I'll let Claire talk about that because they do a fantastic job of that within her trust. I also think it's handing over time to subject-specific CPD, making sure that we are, engaging individuals with the curriculum and training people to have those conversations. I think training people to be able to articulate the curriculum for themselves is key, because if we think about longevity as a profession, what do we want this to look like in 10 years time? We've started on this, the new, without wanting to talk about Ofsted too much, it's half term, the new, the not so new now, Ofsted framework. We're at the start of that journey, aren't we, of refocusing on curriculum work and a knowledge-rich curriculum. Where do we want to be in 5 years as a profession? Are we bringing on our curriculum designers of the future to be able to have respectfully honest conversations with a team in order to be able to identify gaps or holes where our curriculum doesn't necessarily match, or the threads aren't there, either between subjects or within the subjects as a whole, and so where are we that essentially brings on individuals not just with their knowledge of curriculum, but with their knowledge of how to lead a team working on curriculum as well.
This is it. So we talked at the beginning about systems to create the conditions for this work, and we made a decision quite early on with my school, was that we would dedicate time to collaborative planning. And so the timetable is set up in such a way that all teachers in the same subject are timetabled to have some PPA at the same time. And the view is that they spend that time collaboratively planning, and that means talking through what's going to be taught over the next week or so. What are going to be the key misconceptions? How will they be explained? How will they be modelled? What kind of questions would we be asking? How are we adapting our curriculum based on what children have already shown us they know or don't know? but that requires investment. It requires investment of time for teachers to do that, but it also requires investment in terms of training people to do that, because very often, when I speak to schools about collaborative planning and they say, oh, well, yeah, we have collaborative planning, and I say, well, what does that look like? And they say, well, we all go off and we all make our different PowerPoints and then we share them. And that's not collaborative planning. That's not getting to that core of the subject of what and how you're going to teach something. And so there is that investment that's required. And whether or not, if that's not part of your timetable, then actually the other thing that we've done in one of our other schools is to look at no operational meetings. Meetings they have weekly CPD for an hour after school, once a week, and that is collaborative planning time, and that's part of the directed time. So it's using that directed time in a far more meaningful way, and not saying, well, we're going to have a twilight, or we're going to have some generic thing that we're going to do. Actually, it's this constant iterative development of subject knowledge, of planning, of delivery that is, and again, it's about saying this is what's important to us, and therefore it's really, you're going to have the time to do this.
Yeah. I also I think it's about aligning your, for want of a better, I hate the fact that it's called performance management, but it's aligning your performance management policy with work of the curriculum and subject knowledge. So we've approached this by reformatting as a professional development policy, where people's appraisal relies heavily upon, so they make self-made goals at the beginning of the year, which are either subject knowledge focused or pedagogical, or both, so 1 or 2 goals, and then they own that goal over the course of the year, and we don't expect completion as such. It's just engagement with that goal, and again, it's that implicit communication that we're not focusing on data, we're not focusing on outcomes, because we understand that that's a consequence of thinking really hard about curriculum and thinking really hard about your subject. So that's what we'd like you to focus your thinking on over the course of the year, and it actually has led to some really fruitful conversations around conceptual curriculum planning, and thinking carefully about where subject gaps are, and having really honest conversations, because I think previously, if you speak about individuals' professional development and performance management, people didn't want to talk about their gaps in knowledge because it was almost implied as a weakness, where actually if you make that a goal, and we start having honest conversations that we don't know everything about our subjects, then that's a really nice journey to start on for your professional development, of saying, actually, I've had a look at the curriculum that I'm going to be teaching. I've identified that that's probably not my area of expertise, because my degree is in literature, and I'm now teaching language. So that's going to be my area of focus. That's where I'm going to dedicate my energy, which not only upskills that individual, but allows them in quite a non-judgmental way to have that conversation with their coach or their line manager about how they're going to address that. Which, I think that's a key example of using the curriculum as a vehicle for professional development, I think.
And I think that performance management, that reframing of that is really important. I think also reframing how we, observations where you have someone come into your room 2-3 times a year and they give you fairly vague feedback. I mean, when it's all, when we look, and I'm hoping this doesn't happen anymore because it's absolutely abhorrent, graded lesson observations, or
an outstanding lesson.
I mean, I've seen some horrific things like, people's one lesson graded against every teacher standard and RAG rated to give them a grading. It's absolutely horrendous. And what that does is that means that we have this kind of PTSD in education, where when you have someone come into your room, you're worried, and you have to change that culture, because the only way we can get better. Sorry.
And that creates a hangover as well, because what you have then is you have those teachers that come into schools that don't use that practice, that are really focused on developing curriculum and subject knowledge, that they've almost, they've had this encounter of that's what outstanding looks like, or that's what I should be doing. And it's that performative that you can have the most effective, developmental culture in your school, but you're almost having to undo that experience in order to then get that member of staff into a position where they're quite comfortable talking about their subject gaps or talking about their areas of development, and that takes time to undo. And so it's not just a case of, you know, if we talk about toxic schools, it's not just a case of schools not dealing with curriculum in the right way, but it's then those staff that leave and go to other schools and almost take that baggage with them, like a ripple effect, which is just, it's so detrimental to culture as a whole, where schools are really doing some fantastic work around curriculum.
And what we want to do is we want it to be that actually when someone comes in your room, you're like, brilliant, great, you're here.
Pants. Yeah.
But actually what you want to be saying is actually, great, you're here, tell me what I can do, you know, what do you think? And this is something that's really lovely in my school, is that if I go in to see someone's lesson and I'm you know, talking to them about things that they can develop and they can improve, they get really cross with me if I'm saying, well, I can't really think of much to say to you because that was awesome. Actually, no, tell me something that I can do to get better, because they constantly want to get better. It's delightful. And part of the reason for that is that we have this coaching culture, and we use the powerful action steps that Josh Goldrich came up with, an absolutely fantastic platform, which is all about iterative instructional coaching. So you go in to see a lesson, and you have a coach that comes in to see you, or you mutually go and see each other every fortnight, and for 15 minutes, and then you give them something small to deliberately practice over time. And sometimes that might be that you script something together, it might be that you practice or rehearse something together, or it could be as simple as, you know, say the name of the student at the end of your question rather than at the beginning, something really tiny just to tweak their practice. And I think that creating that culture is where you develop really, really strong teachers. And I've seen, quite interestingly, we had a new member of staff come and join us this term who said, you know, I've gone to see this teacher, he's absolutely amazing, I don't know how I'm ever going to teach like that. And I spoke to the teacher he was talking about. I said, can you go and tell him about your teaching practice about a year ago and where you were? And he went back and said, you know, this wasn't how I was teaching a year ago. This is because I've had somebody come into my room every fortnight for 10-15 minutes and give me tiny little bits of drip-fed feedback of really small things that I can change and practice. And that's what's made me the teacher I am today. And it's the most incredible thing to see someone develop like that and be so proud, and also so you know, other people coming in to see them and to be a, you know, one of those people that is a bright spot in your school. And I think we have such potential to develop people in this way if we harness the power of proper instructional coaching, which is, you know, lots of research behind how powerful that can be, but also creating that culture where people want people in their room, that they want people to come and see them. Because I know when I've been in, you know, in previous schools, if someone came in your room to see you teach, it's because there's a rumour has gone around that you're not very good. And actually we need to,
I remember being at a school where you only got feedback on learning walks if you weren't very good. So you didn't actually get any feedback if things were going all right. You'd only hear from someone if you needed to. So it was like signing some sort of death warrant when someone walks in the room. It doesn't need to be like that.
And that in itself, you know, when we have teachers who are struggling and who need support, what we do is we have someone go and watch them teach all the time, which is completely counterintuitive. Like,
how do you feel now?
Go and see someone else. I think that's, you know, give them a program of CPD and watching other people.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I was just thinking, because, you know, you're saying about, you know, watching that person develop for the entire long year. Well, this is the big thing about our curriculum, isn't it, actually? And like you say, we're not experts in it all. So it's not a quick fix, is it? It's not that, it's having that appreciation that actually, do you know what, if there's something within our area that we teach, we can't just go away and spend a weekend reading a book about it and then bringing, you know, and then that's it, brilliant. You know, it's like, I can't spend a weekend doing Seneca physics and just be an amazing physicist. It's
what?
You know.
I thought that's all the kids needed to do. But it's the same, isn't it? I find teaching in spectacles, I find something new every time I return to that play. And that's not just me, but that's the interaction from the class that I've got in front of me as well. You can guarantee a child will always make an insight. I did not even think of that. And that's the beauty of teaching, isn't it? And so if we're saying that, you know, you can go home and in a weekend you nail physics, what are we saying about our subjects? That they are finite and that you can nail them in 48 hours. You know, why are we all talking about curriculum? It should be easy. It's like a 7-day intensive course.
And I think that's so. And it's the thing is, so it's like that year-long development, 2-year-long development, isn't it? 3. And then I think as well, because I was thinking as well about sorry, I'm jumping in now. But like about the primary there as well, because I was thinking that actually, because you know when you're saying about it's like really, you know, that important of knowing. So where did I write it down? But about how when we're looking at our curriculum, should we be working with our feeder primaries and things as well to see, well, number one, actually just ask them outright what their curriculum is and how they're teaching it, but also, I don't know, have those opportunities where we as secondary can share ours, you know, just as the same as they can share theirs. Especially with multiple feeders, you're likely to have, well, you'll have crossovers, but then you're likely to have sort of differences as well. I think it's just like,
yeah, and I think that's just really interesting work to do with looking at how primary approach, particularly English curriculum, looking at how primary approach curriculum and seeing where, you know, where your curriculum joins up and what you can benefit from as well, you know. I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
Pitching, I mean, we know that the primary curriculum has, you know, got incredibly challenging over the last few years. And that we have children who are meant to come through to us knowing things that perhaps, you know, teachers don't know themselves, and having those conversations can be really meaningful. I think also when you're we've talked a lot about kind of secondary curriculum development. I think it's worth kind of talking about primary curriculum development, where it's unlikely that you will be a subject specialist in the curriculum that you're developing necessarily, but I think what we were trying to do with the questions we were asking in the book and the frameworks we were giving in the book is actually saying, well, you may need to buy something in, you may need to take something from somewhere else because of the nature of primary being quite different in the way, but actually how do you develop it, how do you improve it, how do you refine it? You need to know certain things to be able to do so. So I think primary is a really interesting issue. One of the things that we found incredibly beneficial is looking at our Key Stage 2 curriculum for maths and then looking at our Key Stage 3 curriculum for maths and thinking about actually, are we pitching this right? Are we actually expecting children when they get to Key Stage 3 to do as much as we think they actually probably could do if we just push them? And my favourite quote, and the first time I saw it was when Claire Stoneman tweeted it, was you know, a rising tide raises all ships. This idea that actually sometimes I think from what I've seen is that we can, as secondary teachers, sometimes assume that children know less than they do.
Yeah.
And actually, if we engage more with our primary colleagues, we will probably learn a lot about what they can do if we just press the right buttons, if we just nudge in the right directions.
Totally agree. So earlier I was going to jump in and talked about recontextualisation from the discipline to the subject in the school, and you didn't even comment on the national curriculum. Which was interesting. You didn't comment on the national curriculum. We've got a question from Matthew, which is a very good question, because I presume he lives in Wales or teaches in Wales. So what are your thoughts on thematic approaches to secondary school curriculum, and how effective could you see this being in the anticipated curriculum changes in Wales?
Kat, what do you know about the Welsh curriculum? I'm going to say,
well, they've just had
there is limited.
So you, as I think I'm aware, you've got a new curriculum that essentially everybody's from September 22, I want to say, which and I thought it was really interesting because it's this idea of a thematic curriculum. I'm not sure where I fit on that. I think that it's possible. I'm not sure it's the quickest way to the destination, but it's definitely possible. But to work a thematic curriculum is so heavily dependent upon collaborative work, because if you think for particularly the way that we are designed with subject specialists, you need to make sure that the lines of communication between your subject leads are strong in order to be able to make sure that the subjects are being adequately catered for, particularly particularly your core, particularly things like disciplinary literacy across all subjects as well, to make sure that's robust. I think it's definitely plausible. It's not personally to my taste, because I don't think it's necessarily the most effective way to the destination, as I say, but it's definitely plausible as long as you're developing opportunities for subject leaders to have those conversations, I think, because ultimately you need subject specialists driving that, to think about where subjects, you have a danger, I think, with thematic, and you see this in primary as well, that we go, okay, we're going to have this topic, now let's find the text that fits the topic, now let's find the history that fits the topic, instead of thinking, actually, with primary, even if you are teaching thematically, pick your text first and then work your curriculum around the text, work your curriculum around the content that you know is paying service to your subject, that's loyal to the subject, because I think if you go with your themes first, you then run the danger that you're picking substandard content to fit the theme. So I think it's definitely working smart in that sense.
Can I just ask a question about that as well? When we're thinking about like thematic learning and when we're thinking about curriculum planning, what are your views around like cross-curricular planning, particularly at secondary, I'm thinking here? So what are you thinking about that? Because I think historically there's definitely been that kind of like paying tokenistic kind of lip service to it. And I think actually when you start to unpick it, there's definitely some real value to it. I'm thinking about my subject specifically, if I think about cross-curricular links between biology and geography, for example. But then if you think about like history and English literature, for example, there's lots of links there. But I mean, it's clearly not limited to that. That's just limited to my knowledge. But
it's in a meaningful way, isn't it? So I can't sit down as the head of English, if I'm a head of English and I sit down with the head of science and try and orchestrate some sort of link between the two. I think English can help science when we're thinking about hinterland knowledge and telling the stories and the narratives and of people through history and teasing those out, but to marry the two together would be really quite forced, and if we're forcing stuff, then it's probably not the best. Your instinct should tell you that that's probably not the best option. But if we're thinking about, say, for example, in a much more meaningful way, when I put together our Greek mythology unit for year 7, I had quite a detailed conversation with the head of art where I was pulling art that would represent Greek mythology, because I wanted to use fine art as a way of demonstrating the different stories and providing that hinterland. If I'm thinking about history, come back to my earlier point about colonialism, or if I'm looking at kind of the creation of the evolution of the British Empire and how that's going to align. So now, for example, we've pulled the Tempest back to make sure that we look at the Tempest after history of covered British Empire and colonialism and post-colonialism, so that year 8 have that experience beforehand. So as long as it's meaningful, then but I think as soon as we start going, oh, okay, well, on the checklist, it says that we've got to have cross-curricular links, and there's a box on my unit of work that says we've got to have cross-curricular links. That's when it loses all substance. It's as you say, it's lip service, isn't it? I don't know what your thoughts are, Claire.
I think it's also that common language, isn't it? I think it's really worthwhile when you're talking, cross-subject, to be not only using a common language that means that when students bump up against those concepts, they recognise them, but also being able to identify when a concept is bounded by that subject. So, for example, the word contract in law and in English, and in science, contract, law, English, science will mean slightly different things. So understanding where that language is different is useful. I think also, one of the things that we do at my school is we look at the maths curriculum and then the science and geography curriculum. So in science and geography, they are teaching graphs. We start looking at graphs in maths in their disciplinary home, with the idea that, our maths teachers will teach graphs in this particular way, and then geography and science will use a common language when they're teaching graphs in order to not confuse students. And I think that's really useful in terms of making all of those different subjects of teachers a little bit more robust in terms of understanding how to deliver that particular element of their curriculum. But it's not maths for science, it's maths as Nash-led.
I mean, and then it comes down to, you know, you've had those conversations historically where, you know, history will come up to you or geography will come up and go, oh, these kids can't write because they haven't got a formula. Let's use the same formula for English as we do in history, as we do in geography. And then the whole thing falls apart. Whereas actually, if we talk about the mechanics of academic writing and we say, okay, let's provide some analytical verbs, let's provide some evaluative language that we're all going to use, 3 or 4 key words that students are going to be drilled on and know inside out and can apply across that cluster of subjects that enables us to use them in the right way, then that's really meaningful and that's really useful.
But we also have you have the risk as well, though, is that when you are asking an English teacher to teach something related to history and they don't know enough about it, is that they then, they create lots of misconceptions. And a really good example of that is there are lots of English departments that teach the boy in the striped pajamas. They say, oh, because there's a historical connection and there's a bit of history. But actually, it's very poor representation of what the Holocaust was like. It draws lots of misconceptions around the history of concentration camps and of the people in those concentration and of the Nazi officers. And actually what you're doing is you're embedding more misconceptions that those history teachers then have to undo, because the English teacher doesn't necessarily know enough about the history to be able to deal with those misconceptions. But what they say is, what you end up saying is, oh, well, our scheme of work, we've got boy in the striped pajamas, so that's our cross-curricular connection, that's our theme, tick.
Yeah, it's gone in that box.
And that's, the opposite of what you would want to be happening.
I suppose the problem being as well, once those, and we know how, it's amazing, isn't it, when we look at, building our schema and stuff, but how amazing it is that those misconceptions seem to just they proper embed themselves in there, don't they? Much more than sometimes some of the other stuff that we do. And I suppose, thinking about that, like we were saying about those retrieval things and stuff before, it's that trying to unpick those misconceptions, and at what point can you ever potentially get rid of any of those misconceptions as well?
That's the thing as well, is that when you're teaching, if somebody is taught a misconception, that never actually goes away, that never disappears. We're just suppressing that information by teaching it in the correct way. And so I think we underestimate as a profession how damaging teaching the incorrect information is. And that's probably, don't end on that note, because that's probably quite burdensome as we all walk away with the weight of teaching incorrect information. But that's why it's so important that we do the thinking. It's a code full circle. We front load the thinking, that we're solid and secure in our subject knowledge, that we go, okay, this is actually what it should look like. I've spoken to the history teacher so that I know I have some informed knowledge of what students will leave year 7, 8 and 9, with an informed idea of the Holocaust. And that's where I'll place that's where I'll pitch my understanding of the Holocaust when we're having those conversations, and not teach boy in striped pajamas.
So we're not teaching boy in striped pajamas then?
We're not, no.
No. Okay.
We have. I still have a question.
If you want.
I still have a question of my own. However, I'm going to go to Christine. So Christine has said, if you're developing and improving a curriculum for all of your academies across the map, how can you also give your individual departments and teachers ownership and involvement? She said they've previously given each department units to write, but it ends up quite a disjointed curriculum. So what advice?
Yeah, I mean, our kind of project for lockdown was, because obviously we're working remotely, we were essentially all kind of spreading out pieces of work in a similar fashion. The way that we kind of got around that and ensured a sense of collaborative working was that we took our work through a review process. So we ensured that there was a 2-layer review process. So you were working on something individually individually to begin with, but then you had a peer review, so you took it to another individual in order to have a conversation and articulate it and talk through, and then it went through another peer review after you'd revisited it as well. Not necessarily a line manager or, you know, a TLR holder, or there's no sense of hierarchy, but just having conversations and being able to articulate that before it got to the key stage lead or anything was a really, really powerful way of providing a sense of ownership. The other thing that we did do before that was establish our common language, so our expectation. What does success look like in English? What does an effective work look like in English? And we did a great deal of work around almost CPD of curriculum planning for about 5-6 weeks before we even touched getting to the nitty-gritty of a unit of work, which just ensured that the priority was given to the thinking, selecting the key, you know, the core knowledge that we want students to know before we even start putting pieces of work together, because actually having that conversation beforehand enables us to not only think about the knowledge that's going to be within that unit of learning, but also how it connects to the work of other people as well before we even start kind of putting things into documents themselves.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. Joe. When you put all this work in to a curriculum, do you think that you can ever be finished? And assuming the answer might possibly be no, why do you think you can ever finish curriculum? And if not, which I assume not, why not?
I think there's lots of reasons why it's never finished. I think you constantly adapt to, you adapt your curriculum. You should be adapting your curriculum every time you see a student's piece of work, really, shouldn't you? Because you're adapting it in its minutiae. Each time you see, okay, well, we need to reteach this, we need to revisit this, we need to, look at this in more detail. But also, as you add more expertise, as you might bring in different teachers in your department, or you might say that some things work and some things don't. I think. And then also there's an evolution there in terms of responding to outside sources as well. So for example, if we want to recontextualize our subject, and we want to show that recontextualization that's happened to our subject, and we are drawing from the kind of the real world in order to better understand our subjects, then we need to be responsive to what is happening in the real world. A geography curriculum, for example, is likely to evolve a lot over the next few years as as the world changes. And so I think there are lots of different elements that are working on your curriculum that mean that there is this constant organic evolution. And I think what's really important there is it's not about adding more and adding more and adding more. Particularly if you do have things like workbooks, developing your curriculum, making it better, isn't about adding more stuff. And I think Kat's kind of talked about that a little bit already. I don't know if you want to pick up on that, Kat.
Yeah, well, I think it's giving them over to. So we spent a great deal of time when we were looking at implementing workbooks across the curriculum within English, for example, that we ensure that there's time for thinking. And that also, I think something that's overlooked that we perhaps haven't touched on is that use of assessment within curriculum planning, and how actually are we accommodating for that time to ensure that students have the time within. We see so many units of work that map out episodes of learning or lesson by lesson planning that don't actually consider the fact that at some point you've got to provide feedback to students and they need the time to respond to it before we can then move on. And so it almost falls that you have this cram-packed 6-week unit. And instead, actually, what we've done is we've taken, so we carry out, as an example, as a concrete example, five units over the year rather than kind of half-term units, each of 8 weeks, in order to, one, ensure that we have regular writing opportunities for students, but also that they have a fortnightly dedicated feedback lesson, as such, an episode of learning within the workbook, where we are predominantly looking at a prepared model, or the teacher will provide a live model, or share a model that's from one of the students' piece of writing, and then provide kind of whole class feedback that they've put together through looking at the workbooks and the previous work that's completed. By providing that time for formative feedback within your unit, again, it's communication of time, isn't it? We're communicating it to students as priority. It's giving that, I think whenever you put a unit of learning together, it's quite easy to fill it with stuff to do. But actually, where are we giving teachers the opportunity to have those discussions, to have those conversations, instead of, students completing retrieval practice, having a little bit of information given to them, and then doing independent work. And actually, there's a great deal to be learned from those conversations that maybe then doesn't get documented within a workbook or doesn't get written down. Yes, students need to write stuff down, but we need to give that kind of tight, loose approach to the unit of learning, in order to make sure that there's adequate time for the teachers that they're not just hurtling through the stuff,
I think this comes back to a little bit, actually, that question around the trust curriculum development, because actually when you have a trust and you're bringing in more schools into that trust, there are going to be other things that are having an impact on your curriculum and the change you might make, and it might be that it's coming from this alignment. And I think that what we want is, some aligned autonomy, this idea that you've actually got principles that you take through, whether that's at a subject level, whether that's at a school level, or as a trust level. You have these principles that you agree on, and the why behind what you're doing that you agree on. You do a lot of work around what that would then look like, as Kat said, that kind of success criteria. But actually what we're talking about here is whether it's from a workbook to a curriculum to a trust-wide curriculum, the principles remain, which are, you need to do the thinking first and the discussion around why we're doing this, and what we're hoping this will look like later, and why that's so important. I think when you're talking about, the reason we want to do this is because we want to give children the best possible chance in our subject, and this is why we think this is going to help them do so. That's a really powerful starting point. And then whatever you're doing with curriculum, whatever scale you're doing it, it's taking people along with you every step of the way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, what Kat's has talked about, is she's talked about, someone does a workbook and then it goes through various peer reviews. The same goes for curriculum, the same goes for units. But I think what you need to establish first is, what does the big picture look like? And why does it look like that? And I think that, when you start getting onto really big scale, that's when common language becomes so important, because without it, you have got this disjointed fragmentation, because when people go away to do the work, they haven't got those key principles, that key language, and that key understanding or theory in mind. So I think it's so important that we invest time in the theory, in the why, because otherwise what happens is we just focus on what are we going to do? Well, what we're going to do, we're going to have knowledge organisers. That's a real surface, that's a real surface level thing. If you don't understand why you would do that and how they should, how they might be used, how they work, you've got these lethal mutations. And I think too often what we do is we start with what should this, well, this is our curriculum, Matt, this is what it should look like. Yeah. Actually, we need to be spending a lot more time on that thinking on the why. And I think no matter what scale you're on, that's where you need to start.
Do you think we've possibly, do you think some of us have, maybe fallen foul of that sort of, like you say, we get excited, you run away, don't you? You run away and you've made that curriculum map things. I was thinking as well about, I think it was just when you're talking about like the cognitive and it's going back to that recall and the retrieval. And for some reason in my head, I've got this idea about differentiation and just, do you think we need to get to this point where we actually, well, not to a point, but I was just thinking, should we look at differentiation as over our curriculum, as opposed to just these single events in a sense? So actually look at, where do you need to trunk and break down, in which parts of the topics, where does that need to be, I suppose, moved within your curriculum, because where it's going to then feed into those bits later. So like really, really drilling down into each of your I suppose me in science, it's drilling down into each of those topics and knowing what I know that they need to know, what I want them to be able to retrieve, because if they can't, go back to what we were talking about before, Kat, if they can't retrieve some of those other sort of, those basic things, and actually my cue questions will establish that, well, then we're not actually at that point to sort of move on.
Well, I see that less as kind of differentiation and almost as
I know I didn't really want to use the word
interchangeable process. That you're almost like just sweating now, but it's almost that it's that backtracking that you're almost. So if we think of the curriculum as a roadmap, as a journey that a student is going on, and they're at step 3 of, it's almost like a snakes and ladders.
Snakes and ladders.
If you're that's a metaphor. That if you're taking your students to that point and they don't understand that particular concept, and you attempt to continue on that journey, you're leaving that student behind. We need to almost backtrack and go, okay, let's be really secure in our knowledge of that particular concept, that particular idea, of that particular component of knowledge, and only at that point can I take you further along. And using, but that can, if you're using retrieval practice in a holistic way, in a regular kind of minute practice in your everyday questioning, in your explanation, in quite a holistic way, those barriers for students do not become monumental things that they do not understand, where we end up with, oh God, we've got to throw this child in intervention for 3 hours a week because they're at the point where they're so far behind everybody else that I can't actually come to a standstill and reteach them that knowledge, because I've got 29 other children that are so far ahead of them. That actually, if we're quite granular with that process, it means that we're identifying where things aren't quite right, where we've not quite grasped things, as we move along. That it's not that far. If we think about, again, that metaphor, it's not that many steps back, it's not that many places back in order to reteach that knowledge. Okay, we're really secure in that. That's becoming far more established in our schema. Let's then move on. Let's take everybody on that journey. If we're doing that on quite a minute scale, it comes back to your micro-scripting, comes back to your rehearsal, and talking with the teachers about what that looks like. Okay, I'm really worried about this misconception coming up. How am I going to prepare for it? Then we don't get children where they're at year 11 and we're trying to throw the kitchen sink at them.
I think sorry, Claire, I was going to say, I think this fits really well with what you were saying, Claire, about the instructional coaching as well. Like, I think maybe we have a responsibility to use things like instructional coaching to show our staff actually a model how, when they're in that lesson, if they realise they need to backtrack, actually those processes for how to do it, get them practicing, go through it, teach them it so they feel confident enough to stop and do it.
I think it's also, it comes down to that scaffolding as well. So I'm in a school where I can have in the same class a child with a reading age of 5 and a reading age of 7, and another child with a reading age of 17 in the same class. And so what you've got to think about is, I'm not going to make my curriculum easier. What I am going to do is I'm going to think about how I'm scaffolding things. So your example in science would be, for us, that would be, okay, well, we're going to get you to solve this problem. We're going to get you to apply this knowledge. But a couple of you, until you are more confident and you know this by heart, you will have this on a sheet in front of you, just the equation, just like the key things. It might be that the vast majority of the class will do that through retrieval, but there'll be 1 or 2 children where you give them, for that cognitive load, you give them, maybe it's a knowledge organizer, maybe it's some kind of very basic scaffold that allows them to access that lesson the same as everybody else, but gives them that kind of extra stepping stone to do so. And then you gradually take that away. And again, I think it comes down to knowing what meaningful scaffolding looks like. What you never want is, your target grade is this, and you're going to have this worksheet, and your target grade is you're going to have that worksheet. That's absolutely abhorrent.
Do schools still do that? The pastel colour.
So I think, but I think they do, and I think they do, and I think
they? Because that makes me really sad.
I think they do, and I think that as well, that people, it's that you of course you were talking about having lesson observations and stuff before, and I think we know that, and again we've got to talk about misconceptions, but you have all the misconceptions within teaching, don't you? In there, like, if you go and observe a lesson, there's that idea that if a child can tell you the answer, that therefore they know the answer, but actually it's just in their working memory because they're dealing with it. Like, The kid who can't
come back
answer
in
you.
2 weeks' time and they'll have no idea what they
Yeah,
said.
the kid who turns around to you and goes, I haven't got a clue, miss, but then can answer it 2 weeks later has actually learned, but you've got judged on. So
This is again, it's that training for teachers around what does really decent scaffolding look like? What does really good, meaningful, purposeful scaffolding look like? And it's going to look different every single different task that you're doing with that child. You have to think about those components. So how do I break down what I want them to do into their finest components, and what components can I, at this point of the curriculum, give that child to help them access what I want them to do without removing, the learning that I want from them. And that's a really hard thing.
Yeah, and without taking them away from the main curriculum, that we end up having this student that's taken out of the core curriculum that we put so much priority on designing in the first place, to then do this diluted, watered down version that bears no resemblance to what we originally implied to put out. So we can have all those conversations about this incredible curriculum we've all worked collaboratively on, and then this student doesn't benefit from that. Why?
And that goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning, Claire. It's about letting them be part of the beauty, letting them touch the beauty, isn't it? And actually the whole point, I suppose, of us looking at this curriculum design is that it's not for those people that can get up the ladder, and that the snakes, I suppose, with our snakes and ladders analogy, they're now five.
It's not my finest moment.
But the snakes.
I'll use that again.
I mean, the book title is so classy, and we're talking.
No, just completely trashed it.
The kids that have slidden down the snake have they're like 5 steps behind, and then we just leave them in their little snake bucket. Not allowed out.
On box 3 near the beginning, it's terrible, isn't it? Yeah, it's just.
I don't really know.
I'll think of another one. I'll come up with an array of metaphors.
Love it.
I'm an English teacher. That's all I do.
I'm just looking at questions. That there aren't any more questions. We've still got people here that are listening.
God love them.
Bless them. God love them.
I've been out of alcohol for about 30 minutes now.
Yeah.
So let's have a look. We've had comments, so lots of thanking. Obviously, Shireen's put on BBC Today, new university opened in. Now this is throwing Michael Young. It's to be interesting what Young says. So this university will not teach traditional subjects. It will teach. You see, this is.
It's not a real place, is it? Though
they're going to teach climate change.
Okay, but what I think is interesting here, is
we teach that anyway.
But this is the thing. But that's exactly the point. Okay, so when you are an expert in something, you are able to solve problems, right? In that thing, the idea that this is the university degree, you would kind of think that they're coming with a certain base level of knowledge in the first place. Now, I'm not sure about this. I was quite shocked, surprised when Daisy C tweeted about it today to say that she was really excited about it. That was quite I don't know if she's been kidnapped. I don't know if that's.
I don't know what she's excited about. It's a bit dull, isn't it, Jake? To be fair,
what's that?
Climate change.
Oh, yeah. I love it. I mean, I like it. I mean, I would do a degree in climate change. Or a master's. Or actually, you know what? I might specialise in a PhD in it after I've studied the wider discipline.
The language you're using, you'll specialise in climate change. That's a specific thing, isn't it? And then what we're talking
quite niche. It's a bit like zoology, isn't it? You don't know what job. What do you go on to do?
Yeah, what's really interesting. So
we don't get a degree just to get a job, do we? I don't know. That's a whole different debate, isn't it?
If this is a kind of a degree,
it's nice to have a plan, though.
In problem solving, what you're talking about is, I would like to degree in that specific thing, and it always comes back to a really interesting study that I read, Carl Hendrick, who blogged about ages ago, and it was about there were these air traffic controllers who were obviously exceptionally good at their job. They're very, very well, and then they were asked to do a game that they thought would require the same skills as being an air traffic controller, and they did no better in that game than somebody who wasn't an air traffic controller, who was just just anybody. And this idea that actually it's that domain specific knowledge that's required to solve those domain specific problems. And so it's really interesting to me what that would look like if you were saying, well, we're going to take away the domain-specific knowledge, and I don't understand where the substance comes from. So that's going to be really interesting to see where that is.
Where that goes.
Yeah,
because you need that, and I think that's where, like, where still the debates aren't they, about this idea that we can teach skills, because you want these transferable skills to go across places, but actually we can't teach skills. Skills
have become this almost separate entity, when actually, when we're talking about skills, we're just talking about reinterpreting and articulating knowledge for ourselves.
Yeah, it's like manifestation of knowledge in practice, I think is how we describe it in the thing. There isn't a dichotomy, it's just that there is, skill is simply knowledge put into practice.
Yeah.
So this is what's interesting about the thematic curriculum. It's what's interesting about these degrees, is where is the knowledge that's going to allow us to have that expertise. And I can't, who was it, Kat? Was it Michael Young, or was it someone else?
What?
Who talked about, don't talk about skill, talk about expertise. I can't remember who it was.
I want to say it's Hirsch.
Was it Hirsch?
I want to say it's E.D. Hirsch, yeah.
I don't think we talked about Young. Don't talk about skills, talk about expertise, because expertise requires an expert knowledge in something to apply it. And I think this is where that, those questions around the Welsh curriculum, those questions around this degree, that's where I'm interested in where does that expertise come from?
Yeah.
How do you demonstrate a skill without knowledge? You can't. So
you can't.
How does it become a separate?
I know how to write an essay, but if I'm not writing,
how do you evaluate without substance? What you have to evaluate something. So
honestly, I'm amazing at theorising. I can just sit and theorise about anything and everything.
You have to know something about it.
But you need to theorise something. You can't just theorise.
Lou, should we stop recording now? Do you think? No more questions, and then should we invite people in?